How do you think the Russo-Ukrainian War will actually end? Starting in 2014 with the Russian annexation of Crimea and support of Donbas insurgencies, and escalating majorly with their subsequent invasion of Ukraine as a whole in 2022. Few think the war will end in the near future due to the fact that the front lines haven't changed majorly since the fall of last year's, which has led many people to not think about how the war itself will actually end. In theory, there's three possibilities: a Russian victory, a stalemate, or a Ukrainian victory, but ultimately it's far more complicated than this. There's the first obvious question of what the borders will look like after the war is done. Will Ukraine regain control of its southeastern regions, or will Russia's annexations of Donetsk, Luhansk, Kherson, and Zaporizhzhia become permanent? Will Crimea ever be returned to Ukraine? And could democratic referendums ever actually be held in any of the aforementioned regions? Borders, however, aren't the only question. There's the other question of whether or not Ukraine will join NATO following the end of the war, regardless of whether or not they win. That also leads to another question of whether countries like Georgia, Moldova, and Azerbaijan might also join. And also, there's the bigger questions. If Russia loses, will Vladimir Putin be ousted from power? If Putin does leave power, could Russia become more democratic and shift towards the West? Or if Russia wins and keeps control of some part of eastern Ukraine, what will their global relations look like, especially with China? Which brings me to the next point. How will the war affect China's decision whether or not to invade Taiwan? My gut feeling is a Korean-style ceasefire that blocks NATO entrance, but I can't back this opinion up at all, so don't ask me to defend it. I think the war will end when Putin dies or is overthrown. He has too much invested in it and ego won't let him back away. Putin would need to get tired or face internal resistance. Then he'd start negotiating. But, like the US and Vietnam, that would drag on for years, maybe decades. Maybe the Russian economy would finally buckle, maybe support for Ukraine would fade. We'll have to wait it out and see. Either side could lose, but it's not gonna be won. The fighting will continue for 2-3 years at least. After that, both sides will be exhausted and there will be some kind of agreement based on the current positions they hold. I have always thought this war will end when the Russian people finally have had enough. Russia has already lost this war, they just haven't decided how they're going to lose. It will not end. In my point of view, after allowing Ukraine to use fragmentation bombs, and after China and USA returned commercial transitions, it will be an endless war to destroy the Russia power, and take advantage of Ukrainian resources. Besides that, the other alternative would obligate NATO to intervene directly, which would cause a World War III. One senior UKR diplomat wrote in April, "The only option to win is to grind our into dust." He wrote that as to Europe, our never lived up to its treaty commitments. He was emphatic our would not change its political goals or intentions. I think when Ukraine gets the F-16s, that will turn the war. My guess is they get them and they turn the tide to the point that the war is essentially decided going into the 2024 election and gives Biden a little bump, because, why let a good tragedy go to waste? No matter how long it takes, it will end only with Putin's death. His successor will pull back from most Ukrainian land occupied since February 2022. A ceasefire will be negotiated in which Donbas will get autonomous status with close ties to Russia, Crimea will formally stay Ukrainian but factually stay Russian, leasing agreement for 100 years or something like that. The wording on the paper will allow Ukraine to not legally give up land and simultaneously claim not to have any border disputes, so that they can get into NATO. What will happen immediately? Russia will have one Crimea. If we go the peaceful-ish way, I think it would be when or if Donald J. Trump wins the election and forces Ukraine to make a deal with Russia in which they will lose Donbas regions and Russia will stand for the economic results. If I remembered correctly, Trump was bitching about NATO members not putting in their fair share of the costs in the alliance. Some have also commented NATO was a relic of the past and should have been disbanded when the Berlin Wall USSR fell. Then Putler decided to remind the whole world why NATO is needed, and now the whole world understood what happens when you leave authoritarianism unchecked. This Russo Ukrainian war should end in Ukrainian victory. Anything else is just sending a wrong message to would-be or up-and-coming dictator. Settled peace with most Ukrainian terms met, save Crimea. Maybe this is just what I am hoping for, but I think a demilitarized international economic zone needs to be part of the solution here. Both sides at this point would essentially act as occupying forces. An internationally brokered, guaranteed and administered at least at first, but using as much local administration as possible neutral zone is the best solution for the world, and the people inside Crimea. Drawn-out quagmires are better for defense contractors and war pigs, so that's my vote, and nothing really will change after it as far as territory, and then it's time for rebuilding contracts for the politically connected. Nothing new ever happens. Russia will do what it needs till either NATO gets involved and turns it into World War II, or the oligarchs will let it end so that they can begin the rebuild, and rack in $500 billion in profits. Zelensky will be killed by the Azov troops of Ukraine for surrendering. Well, Ukraine will not be allowed in NATO until Russian boots leave Ukrainian soil, so if Russia doesn't want Ukraine to join NATO, which it doesn't, that's the entire reason for the war in the first place. All Russia would need to do is keep a small force in Ukraine. Ultimately, though, these are the same people in charge. The sort of Soviet Union essentially fall apart due to a 10-year war in a country much farther away in Ukraine. So a multi-decade conflict that eventually leads to great political people and probably another revolution would not be surprising. US support is only prolonging the inevitable Russian victory. At some point the money will stop pouring in from the West and it will be over. Russia has not come close to using the full force of its military might. The fact that Putin has shown some restraint is the only reason he may face pressure at home. Even Zelensky must realize now that its NATO allies are not going to commit much longer and are invested less in a Ukraine victory than a prolonged proxy war. There will be a negotiated peace in which Russia will keep Crimea and nothing else. Ukraine will not join NATO. AI drones from Russia fly in and kill everyone, the Ukrainian gov. And then Russian puppets take over. By Putin declaring the special military operation successful and withdraws from the area between Kherson and Mariupol. Then back to the Donbas war again, which likely will be a stalemate for the foreseeable future. I'll put it this way: there will be at least one loser. There will not be any middle ground good ending. While Putin is in power, it will never end. He has built many layers of insulation around himself, security forces etc. from oligarchs, and they systematically disappear like Prigozhin without ever being seen again. Putin doesn't eat humble pie, and therefore this will likely go on until a stalemate, if ever. All I can think of in this conflict, as with the American invasion and occupation of Afghanistan, is the interaction between Michael and Hyman in The Godfather 2. Michael Corleone: I saw a strange thing today. Some rebels were being arrested. One of them pulled the pin on a grenade. He took himself and the captain of the command with him. Now, soldiers are paid to fight, the rebels aren't. Hyman Roth: what does that tell you? Michael Corleone: they could win. Meta best thread on that subject so far here on Reddit. You won't have that kind of deep and fair discussion on Ukraine war video report, for instance. Democracy is not a tradition in Russia. I think a new dictator will take over after Putin. When the Russian soldiers and their families get sick of their friends dying, they will turn on Putin. The head of the snake needs to be cut off. The most likely scenario is where the cratering economy affects enough of the financial elite, that a plot hatches to kill Putin. It's a mafia family in effect, and they will have to penetrate his inner circle and buy off some of them protecting him, then put a slug in his head. That gives an off-ramp and the Russian scum leave Ukraine. I think it will end in a peace treaty that neither side is happy with. I hope it will end in a peace treaty that Ukraine is happy with.